Hello, I'm Rachel from Douentza Garden in Ireland, and today is all about propagating lilies. Oh yes, there are 6 different ways that you can propagate lilies, and today I'm going to show you how to do 4 of them. So I'm going to show you how to propagate lilies by scaling, by division, by bulbils, and also by leaf cuttings, but I'm also going to talk you through how to propagate by bulblets and growing them from seed. So without further ado, let's go into the greenhouse and let's propagate these lilies. You are very welcome to the video and to my greenhouse, and if you're new to the channel, well, that's great. We're going to start off today by propagating lilies by scaling. Now, this is a method that can be done at this time of year in autumn, and you should generally use lilies, fresh lilies that you've dug up from your garden. So this one here is one that I dug up just now, a minute ago, but I also bought some from a shop. The problem with shop bought lilies is that you can't really know how fresh they are. I always find that if you go to a garden centre, the lilies have been there for a long time at very warm temperatures, so they're not in optimal condition. Whereas if you order them by mail order, they tend to, they tend to be fresher. But anyway, we're going to try with this one that I found in the garden centre as well. And you know what, that doesn't look too bad at all, so we will try propagating with the best of these two. They still feel quite moist and they're firm enough. We'll try it with this one as well as the one from the garden. So here are our 2 lilies, and this method of propagation is of course vegetative, which means I should get an identical plant to the parent. Now, for propagation by scaling, what you need to do is remove the outer scales of your lily bulb, and you need to do it ensuring that you get a little piece of the basal plate, which is this section down here. So I am just going to try to snap this off. Now you see that's not good because it broke before I got to the basal plate. So I won't have success with that particular scale. But let's try with this one here. Okay, that's a little better. We have a little bit of the basal plate there. You can take as many of these scales as you like. However, if you plan on replanting this particular lily bulb, then don't take too many. And now for the shop bought lily. Some of these outer scales don't really look very well, so I think I'm just going to discard them. And that one's quite damaged too, so I'll discard that. Shop bought lilies. Okay, I'm going to take a few of the better ones. There is one. There. As a rule of thumb, Asiatic species have white bulbs, trumpet lilies have purple tinged bulbs, and Martigan and Oriental bulbs are yellow. Now there are 2 ways of doing this. You can either put your scales in a plastic bag in moist vermiculite, or you can make up a mix, which I'm doing here. And your mix should be 50% horticultural grit and 50% potting compost. Now, if you're propagating acid-loving lilies, then use an ericaceous mix. But if you're doing Asiatic lilies, ones that are kind of more neutral, then you can just use an ordinary potting mix, an ordinary compost. So I'm going to use a tray to put my scales in, and it's one with holes at the base. Now I prefer this to individual cells, and I'm just going to place it down here and put the mix in. Just going to level my mix a bit with the tamper. And the next step is to bury the lily scales to about 2/3 of their depth in the mix. So we're going to put these ones from the garden on this side. You need to ensure that the basal plate is pointing down. Now you can expect 1 to 7 little bulbils to form at the base of these scales. So it's a really good return on your sacrificed lily, let's just say. So basal plate down and pointy bit up. Okay, so now for the other ones. Some of these are really quite damaged at the tip, so we'll see how that turns out, whether they actually strike or not. Only time will tell. And of course, let's not forget to label them. The next step is to water your lilies in well. Let them drain and to cover them. The next step is to place your lilies in a cold frame. Now I'm placing them in the cold greenhouse instead. I'm just placing my tray of lily scales over here beside my sprouting primroses, and I will wait. I much prefer to plant my lily scales and to leave them in the greenhouse rather than to put them in the plastic bag and bring them into the house, because if you bring them into the house, the bulbils will form, but you're going to have to give them a cold treatment before the trigger will set in to grow roots and to grow top growth. Whereas if you just leave them directly here in a cold frame or in the greenhouse, then you don't have to worry about all that. Once roots and top growth are forming well at some stage in spring next year, then you can pot your little bulbils on separately. The second propagation method for lilies is dividing, and I just want to show you very briefly how to do this. Now there's no science to it, but in late summer or early autumn what you need to do is to dig up a clump of lilies in your garden. Do it carefully, make sure you go wide enough around the lily bulbs that you don't damage them in the process. And once you've dug all the way around and loosened the soil, then lift the clump up. You will need to cut off the spent lily spikes a couple of inches from the bulb, and then you can see more clearly what's happening. You may want to hose the clump down a little bit just to get a better handle on what's where, and then very carefully separate the lily bulbs and replant immediately. Many lilies really bulk up over time, and if you find that a clump of lilies isn't doing well or has stopped flowering in parts, perhaps in the middle section, then it really is time to divide them. Besides, by dividing you can increase your stock and make sure that you have plenty of those gorgeous lilies for everywhere in your garden. The third lily propagation method that I want to show you today can only be done with certain types of lilies, tiger lilies for example, and these other 3 or 4 that I'm listing up here on the screen. So these are lilies that will naturally produce bulbils in the leaf axils. You will start to see these bulbils form from midsummer, and even in very small plants they will still produce. These tiny embryo bulbs, if left to their own devices, are unlikely to get to maturity, but if you collect them, you can grow them into mature bulbs in quite a short period of time. Harvest your bulbils when they're mature, usually around September. You'll know when they're mature because they'll come away easily, and you may see tiny roots at their base. Sow your bulbils like seed in trays about 2.5 centimeters apart, and I did this earlier on in the year. If you look for my video on sowing seeds in September, you'll see me planting my lily bulbils. Use the same mix for sowing your lily bulbils as I use today for the scale method. So 50% horticultural sand or grit and 50% potting compost. Cover with a layer of compost and water well. Place the pot or tray in a cold frame or greenhouse and keep just moist. Now the bulbils probably won't start growing until next spring. There may be stuff happening below ground level with roots, but we won't see any top growth until spring. Once roots are poking out at the base of pots, or at the base of the tray in my case, then it's time to pot your bulbils on. Put them on individually into separate pots and keep them moist. You'll need to fertilize them with a low nitrogen liquid fertilizer every now and again, and you should get flowers within 2 to 3 years. Okay, now I'm going to show you how to propagate lilies from cuttings. Yes, you heard me correctly, from cuttings. Now this is an unusual way to propagate lilies, and it can only be done with certain types of lilies, with the Asiatic types specifically. So it's not something I've actually done in my garden because, as you know, I have naturally acidic soil. Therefore, I tend to grow other types of lilies than Asiatic ones. Also, with this method, it needs to be done in springtime, round about April, I think. So I can't actually show you in real life here today, but I'm going to go through the motions just to let you see how it would be done. So the first thing you need to do is to find your lily. And here we're looking at a lily that's growing in my border here in autumn. Now, as I said, this is a process that needs to be done in spring. So I'm only doing this for illustrative purposes. Now, you need to remove the leaves by breaking them, pulling down. And you do it by pulling down so that you manage to remove a bit of tissue from the stem with your leaf, in the same way as you might collect a heel cutting. And that little bit of tissue from the stem is going to be instrumental in getting those leaves going. The next thing we need to do is to dip our leaves in hormone rooting powder, not too much, and now we are going to pot them up in a mixture of pure sand, pure horticultural sand. I'm only going to put a little bit of sand at the base of the pot now, and you'll see why. So here we have my first leaf, and I think probably these are big leaves, so we would only put one in this pot, and then I would just place horticultural sand around the leaf until we've got, maybe a good bit of the leaf covered, like that. And then this gets covered, it gets watered and covered either with a plastic bag or a lid and left in a cold frame. By this process, what we're doing is triggering the lily's natural inherent ability to form bulbils in the leaf axil. And you should see small bulbils within a month. And finally, just to let you know that there are 2 more ways to propagate lilies. One is by bulblets. Now, bulblets are like tiny little bulbs that form along the stem of the lily, but under the ground. And at this time of year in autumn, what you can do is just scrape the soil back at the neck of your lily stem and look for the bulbils, and they can be removed and just grown on separately. If they stay in situ around the main lily bulb, then you'll get a nice big clump over time, but you may want to remove them just to give them to friends or to propagate them for elsewhere in the garden. So that's another method of propagating lilies, which I can't actually show you because I don't have any lilies that do that form the bulblets. And of course, those are the 5 vegetative means to propagate lilies. With vegetative propagation, what always happens is that you end up with a young plant that is identical in every way to the parent plant. So even if your lily is a hybrid, you should get a plant that looks like the parent as a result of one of these means of propagation. But there is of course seed propagation, and you can grow lilies from seed. It just is the long haul. The easiest way to do it, and the one that I've done, I've experienced really only of growing a couple of different types of lilies from seed: Formosana, Douentza and Martacan lilies, and all I did was collect the seed, sow it and leave it in the greenhouse in the cold frame over winter for the a number of lilies do need a cold period in order to trigger germination, and it worked for those 3 species. It's not difficult, but it is the long haul, and you'll get baby plants much more quickly by using one of the vegetative means of propagation. Okay, and I guess that just about brings me to the end of this video, all about propagating lilies in various ways. Isn't it amazing? Normally with plants you have like 1 or 2 means of propagating them, not the whole range that lilies have at their disposal. So why not try some of them? It's the right time of year, it's fun to do, and why not bulk up your stock? Why not have lots of your favourite lily? Thank you as always for watching, and I will see you on the next video. Bye!